1940, the North Atlantic. Endless gray skies stretch over a frozen sea choked with salt spray and the groan of steel convoys slicing toward Britain. Beneath them, silent, unseen, lurks a nightmare. German U-boats, the wolves of the sea, strike without warning, dragging ships, cargo, and entire crews to the bottom. Britain is starving. America is watching. The Battle of the Atlantic is not a battle, it's a massacre. Allied ships are sinking faster than they can be built. In war rooms from London to Washington, panic simmers. Naval experts, engineers, and admirals throw every conventional tactic at the problem. None work. Until one day a quiet, eccentric man in a worn wool coat walks into the British Admiralty. He carries no rank, no command, just a box of hand-drawn diagrams and a voice few take seriously. They dismiss him at first. He's not one of them. But his idea, it will soon turn the tide of the longest and most brutal campaign of World War II. This is the story of Edward George Bowen, the rejected inventor who defied the doubters, outwitted the most feared hunters in the Nazi arsenal, and built the secret weapon that changed the Atlantic War forever. The Battle of the Atlantic didn't look like a battle. There were no trenches, no bombs lighting up the sky, just cold, endless sea and sudden death. The Kriegsmarine had unleashed its deadliest creation, the U-boat. Sleek, silent, and terrifyingly effective, these underwater predators haunted the convoys that fed Britain. At their peak, they were sinking hundreds of ships every month, tankers full of oil, freighters stacked with food, men, machines, and hope, all dragged to the bottom. By early 1941, Britain's lifeline was unraveling. Churchill called it the only thing that ever really frightened me. The Royal Navy was overwhelmed. Destroyers ran endless, exhausted loops escorting convoys, hoping to spot the periscope before the torpedo. Depth charges were dropped blind, more prayer than precision. There were whispers in the Admiralty that if this continued, Britain might fall, not from invasion, but from starvation. But in the quiet labs of southern England, away from the command rooms and battlefield maps, a group of scientists worked in obscurity. They were part of the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, a patchwork team of physicists, engineers, and dreamers. And among them was a young Welshman named Edward George Bowen. Bowen didn't look like a soldier. He wasn't one. He was small, bookish, and often described as impatient, even awkward. But inside him was a relentless fire. Since the early 1930s, he'd been obsessed with one idea, radar. At the time, it was science fiction, waves detecting planes in the sky. Many dismissed it as fantasy, but Bowen saw something deeper. He didn't just want to see planes, he wanted to hear submarines. Track them, hunt them before they could strike. There was one problem. The Royal Navy didn't believe it could be done. To many at the top, sonar, also called ASD-IC, was the only option. It worked by bouncing sound underwater. But it had flaws. It only worked when the ship was moving slowly. And worst of all, it couldn't detect surfaced U-boats at night, when they did most of their killing. Bowen's idea was different. He believed you could mount airborne radar onto planes, fly them over the ocean, and detect the periscopes and conning towers from the sky. A silent eye watching from above. The Navy laughed him out of the room. "No aircraft radar will ever find a periscope," one officer scoffed. Too small, too fast, too rough a sea, but Bowen didn't stop. Rejected by the establishment, he retreated to his lab and worked in secret. Every night he adjusted signal frequencies. Every day he studied how radar waves bounced off different surfaces. His team was small, his budget smaller. But they had one weapon no one could measure: conviction. The breakthrough came in 1940 with a machine called Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar, ASV Mark. Second, it was bulky, crude, and almost entirely untested. But in theory, it could detect a submarine from 5 to 10 miles away, at night, in fog. Bowen believed it could change everything, but no one would put it on a plane, until a quiet miracle happened. One that changed Bowen's fate in the course of the Atlantic War. A Royal Air Force Coastal Command officer, desperate for anything to stop the slaughter, gave Bowen's radar a chance. A single patrol bomber lumbering into the sky carrying the first ASV radar, was sent over the Atlantic. And then it saw something. A faint blip in the middle of nowhere. A U-boat on the surface. The crew locked eyes on it, dropped their flares, then released their depth charges. Kill confirmed. It was the first time in history an aircraft had used radar to sink a submarine, and it was just the beginning. The sinking of that first U-boat should have been a triumphant turning point, a rallying cry for a new chapter in the war. But for Edward George Bowen, it became something else entirely, a deeper war, not against the Nazis, but against the very system he was trying to save. In the aftermath of the successful radar strike, there was no parade, no grunt recognition, no immediate orders to scale the technology across the fleet. Instead, silence, skepticism, bureaucracy. The Royal Navy still didn't trust radar, and the Air Ministry wasn't far behind. To many senior officers, the victory was a fluke, a statistical anomaly. One hit meant nothing unless it could be repeated, proven, and standardized. But more than that, there was pride at stake. The old guard didn't like that a civilian, a non-combatant, had done what legions of trained naval officers could not. They especially didn't like how fast he moved, how he broke rules, how he bypassed channels and dared to demand urgency in a world bound by paperwork and tradition. Bowen wasn't just facing opposition, he was surrounded by it. Even within his own division, some scientists argued that radar was better suited for aircraft detection, not submarines. They urged him to redirect his efforts. But Bowen refused. He had stared too long into the horror of convoy losses, seen the eyes of mothers losing sons to the sea, and he knew what was possible. He doubled down. He poured his life into refining ASV radar, testing it across windswept airfields, pushing signal frequencies to their limits, and demanding flight crews to run exhausting test runs over Blackwater at night. He wrote letters, pleaded with ministers, delivered raw data directly to commanders when bureaucrats tried to bury it. Each night he slept a little less. Each day he saw one more freighter lost and wondered if he'd acted fast enough. The technology still had problems. The early radar sets were large, heavy, and prone to failure. The signal bounce was inconsistent, and the detection range unreliable in stormy weather. And worst of all, even when radar did locate a U-boat, most aircraft couldn't attack fast enough. The submarines would dive before the bombs fell. The solution, Bowen believed, was not just radar, but something with radar. A light source, a surprise, something the U-boats couldn't see coming. That's when Bowen turned to an even wilder concept, a secret weapon that had already been shelved once before. Lee Light. Invented by squadron leader Humphrey DeVere Lee, the Lee Light was a 22 million candle power searchlight mounted under the wing or nose of patrol aircraft. Bowen saw the potential immediately. The radar would find the U-boat, but the Lee Light would blind it. As soon as the aircraft closed in, the light would switch on, flooding the pitch-black ocean with searing white light, exposing the submarine and stunning the crew. It would give the bomber precious seconds to drop depth charges before the U-boat could dive. The Navy hated it. Too experimental, too heavy, too unproven. And above all, they believed surprise night attacks were impossible anyway. But Bowen didn't wait for permission. He collaborated directly with Lee and a few sympathetic RAF squadrons. They rewired planes, welded custom mounts, calibrated power supplies by hand. It was crude, desperate engineering, but it worked. On a cold April night in 1942, a Liberator bomber equipped with both ASV radar and a Lee Light spotted a surfaced U-boat. At 2,000 feet, the radar locked on. The pilot dove. At just 1,000 feet, the Lee Light switched on, blasting the Atlantic in unnatural daylight. The German crew froze. They hadn't seen it coming. Moments later, the aircraft dropped a cluster of depth charges. Another kill. This time instantaneous. Word spread quickly. Coastal Command pilots began begging for Lee Light radar-equipped aircraft. They called them ghost eyes in the skies. Convoy losses, once a slow bleed, began to taper. By late 1942, Bowen's technology was deployed across more squadrons. The shift was dramatic. U-boat commanders, once fearless, now dove during the day and stayed submerged at night. Hitler's wolf packs were starving. The Atlantic began to shift. But the fight wasn't over. Bowen still faced a wall of resistance. Military bureaucracy was a slow machine, and scaling radar across the fleet required endless battles for materials, manpower, and time. Steel was rationed. Aircraft were prioritized for the European front, and radar production was dangerously behind schedule. Bowen, exhausted and stretched thin, was forced to fight a war within the war, begging for factories, training operators, troubleshooting misfires in the field, and trying to improve the radar's precision with each passing week. Then came the real test, Black May. In May 1943, Hitler launched a desperate U-boat offensive. Hundreds of submarines surged into the North Atlantic to choke off the last arteries to Britain. For Edward Bowen, victory brought no peace. The Atlantic War may have turned, but within him, a deeper storm brewed, one that no radar could detect. In the eyes of the world, he was still largely unknown, overshadowed by generals and air marshals whose names filled headlines. But in the silence of his own mind, Bowen carried every name that never would, every sailor swallowed by the cold, every convoy lost before his invention reached the skies. His radar had arrived just in time to win the war, but too late to save thousands. That truth haunted him, not as guilt, but as a terrible knowing, a sense that brilliance is never fast enough when measured in lives. In the long corridors of the telecommunications research establishment, Bowen kept working. His desk was rarely clean, his clothes often rumpled, his fingers stained with ink and copper. He had become a man obsessed with silence. Not the quiet of rest, but the silence between blips on a radar screen. The silence before death. He knew what it had cost to pierce that veil, and what it would be if they ever let it slip again. His colleagues admired him, but they rarely understood him. Bowen was no longer just an engineer. He was a man who had seen too much. Not on the front lines, but in the data, in the reports of missing ships, in the sonar logs filled with sudden cutoffs, the last echoes of hulls breaking apart in the deep. To Bowen, radar was not just technology. It was a way to buy time, a way to make the invisible visible, to give commanders foresight where there had only been reaction. But the world outside the lab was moving on. Normandy had been stormed. Rome was liberated. The headlines had shifted to land battles, liberation, the endgame in Berlin. Radar, once a miracle, was becoming a footnote. The light, once feared, now gathered dust in decommissioned aircraft. Yet Bowen knew better. He had touched the future. He had glimpsed what came after war, the age where surveillance would define power more than any bomb. Still, even as the Allies pushed into Europe, his fight wasn't over. His ASV radar had exposed surfaced submarines, but the Germans adapted. They developed radar detectors, warning U-boats of incoming patrol planes. The deadly chess game continued. Bowen fought back with radar jamming technology, pulse modulation, and frequency hopping. He was constantly racing shadows, each innovation answered by another countermeasure. It was a war of minds, not missiles, and it drained him. He began to question himself in quiet moments. Had he done enough? Could he have moved faster? Could he have forced the Navy to listen earlier? He replayed every meeting, every dismissal, every moment someone in uniform laughed at his equations. And always, he returned to one cruel question. How many died while they waited for permission to listen? The emotional toll was immense. Bowen, still a young man, looked older by the day. Sleep was rare. His notebooks grew darker, scribbled not only with calculations but with philosophical questions. What is the cost of doubt? What is the cost of delay? Unlike soldiers, scientists fought with time, and time was the most brutal enemy of all. But despite it all, he never stopped. Because underneath the exhaustion, the self-doubt, and the ache of nearly being too late was something stronger, a belief. Not in his own genius, but in the duty of invention. Bowen believed that science, when used with courage, could be the purest act of resistance. That to invent something that saves lives is no less heroic than storming a beach. And for every submarine sunk, for every convoy saved, he reminded himself, this wasn't just technology, it was redemption. As the war entered its final phase, Bowen turned his attention to what came next. He began sketching systems for airborne interception, radar that could lock onto enemy aircraft in real time. He theorized about radar arrays small enough to mount on fast-flying jets, even on ships. His mind moved ahead by years, sometimes decades. The war had forged him into something beyond an engineer, a visionary, but it had come at a price. His personal life began to fray. He rarely spoke of emotions, rarely opened up. Colleagues later recalled how he would suddenly go quiet when asked about U-boats, his eyes distant. When congratulated, he would nod politely, then change the subject. He didn't want applause, he wanted urgency, because somewhere in the back of his mind, the war was still happening. And radar, the weapon he had once built with bare hands and borrowed parts, was still evolving. The legacy of Bowen's work rippled outward. SV radar became the foundation for modern anti-submarine warfare. His early innovations inspired the post-war creation of airborne early warning systems, like WWII. His work shaped how navies patrolled oceans, how aircraft scanned terrain, how satellites now orbit silently overhead. But Bowen never chased fame. When the war ended, most of Britain exhaled. Cities dimmed their blackout curtains, families embraced returning soldiers, and the streets of London echoed once more with laughter, not sirens. But for Edward George Bowen, peace didn't come with silence. It came with purpose. In the charred aftermath of history's deadliest conflict, a new era was rising, one colder, quieter, and filled with shadows, the Cold War. And while nations rebuilt with brick and hope, Bowen began building again with waves and frequencies. His wartime innovations had transformed the Atlantic, but the world had grown larger. New threats would come from higher skies, deeper oceans, and faraway continents. Radar, once born in desperation, was now becoming civilization's second sight. Bowen's post-war years were not spent in celebration, but in evolution. He understood perhaps better than anyone that the war hadn't ended. It had shifted. New enemies were forming, and their weapons would be faster, their reach global, their attacks invisible until it was too late. And so Bowen, now a senior figure in British and international scientific circles, pivoted his work toward long-range surveillance and airborne early warning systems. He foresaw a world where battles would begin not with bullets, but with detection, and he was determined to ensure the free world would never be caught blind again. From his work in the United Kingdom, Bowen was soon invited to Australia, where he would shape the future of Commonwealth defense technology. There, in sun-bleached labs far from the gray Atlantic, he led the development of the first radar systems in the Southern Hemisphere. He helped transform Australia from a passive observer into an active guardian of its skies. Under his guidance, early warning systems were calibrated to detect anything: missile launches, jet incursions, even atomic threats. Bowen was laying the groundwork for what would become the global security architecture of the modern world. Yet, as always, he did so in the background, refusing to step into the limelight. Even as global attention turned to the atomic bomb and jet fighters, Bowen never wavered from the humble brilliance of electromagnetic waves. He understood their power wasn't in destruction, but in foresight. In 1947, while the world obsessed over post-war treaties, Bowen was testing radar that could track weather systems, enabling meteorological predictions that saved lives from natural disasters. He worked on civil aviation systems, helping to establish air traffic radar protocols that still guide airplanes today. The same man whose invention once hunted submarines was now protecting travelers at 30,000 feet. Yet few knew his name. His contributions, vital and vast, were often buried beneath the laurels of more publicized figures. Bowen did not mind. In fact, he preferred it. His satisfaction came not from ceremonies, but from results, from the quiet reassurance that his inventions were watching over people, even if those people never knew. That was the kind of hero Bowen had always been, the unseen sentinel. But even heroes built from science are human. In private, Bowen sometimes reflected on how close it all had come to failure. Had he listened to his doubters? Had he backed down in 1940 when the Navy dismissed his radar as fantasy? The Atlantic might have remained a graveyard. Hitler's submarines could have starved Britain into surrender. D-Day might never have launched. The war could have dragged on for years with unspeakable consequences, all because one piece of technology, An invisible wave bouncing off steel had not been believed in soon enough. This thought haunted him, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The lessons were sharp and personal. Great ideas often arrive dressed as heresy, and those who bring them are rarely welcomed at first. Courage is not always on the battlefield. Sometimes it lives in the lab, in the sleepless nights, in the broken prototypes, in the voice that keeps speaking even when the room goes silent. By the 1960s, Bowen had become a scientific statesman of sorts. Universities sought him, governments consulted him, honors finally came. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society, knighted for his contributions to science. But he remained grounded, almost reluctant. He often said that science should serve humanity, not fame. In quiet interviews, he would shift focus to the teams around him, the other scientists who carried the weight of war with wires and soldering irons. He never once claimed to be the man who changed the Atlantic War, but those who knew the truth knew better. What Bowen left behind wasn't just a technology, it was a philosophy. That progress belongs not to those with the loudest voice, but the clearest vision. That when institutions move slowly, individuals must sometimes move fast. And that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can come, not from fire or bomb, but from the calm, persistent pulse of innovation. In the end, what Edward George Bowen gave to history cannot be measured by ships saved or submarines sunk. His radar wasn't just an invention, it was a declaration, a quiet defiance against the idea that only uniforms and commands shape the fate of nations. His story reveals a deeper, often unseen truth about war, that the greatest battles are not always fought in the mud or sky, but in the minds of those who dare to question what's possible. Bowen's courage was not loud. It didn't march. It didn't fire. It endured through failure, through ridicule, through the chilling knowledge that every day his ideas were delayed, good men died screaming into the cold Atlantic. That is a different kind of bravery. One forged not in fire, but in silence. What drove Bowen was not ambition. It was clarity. He saw the ocean as more than water. He saw it as a graveyard waiting to be interrupted. He looked at war not just as destruction, but as a race between death and discovery. And in that race, he gave everything he had. There were no guarantees, no applause. Every improvement in his radar system came with exhaustion. Every battle he fought with the military establishment cost him time. And yet, he kept going, because someone had to. Because beneath the reports, the diagrams, the interference patterns, there were lives. This perhaps is the most human part of Bowen's journey. He was not born to be a hero. He was not trained to fight. He was a curious boy from Swansea who liked radio waves, who found beauty in frequencies and wonder in oscilloscopes. He never asked to be in the war, but war came for everyone. And when it came for him, he met it not with a rifle, but with resolve. He did not run, he built. And he built something that no storm could sink. When we remember World War II, we often speak of tanks, invasions, and the roar of engines over Europe. We talk of flags and treaties, of bombers and blockades. But stories like Bowen's remind us that the war was also won in quiet rooms, in the whirring hum of machines, in the trembling hands of engineers soldering connections at midnight, in the restless eyes of men staring at radar screens, praying that one small blip would appear in time to save a ship full of strangers. Bowen's life after the war was not glamorous. He returned to research, wrote papers, mentored younger scientists. Occasionally, the spotlight found him, but he never stayed in it. And maybe that was the truest mark of his greatness. He did not need to be seen. His work saw for him. His legacy is stitched into every modern radar dome, every control tower, every defense system that watches over us while we sleep. He did not shout his name into history, but his silence echoes through it. And as the world spins on, faster, more connected, more fragile than ever, we find ourselves surrounded by systems Bowen helped inspire. Air traffic radars guiding thousands of flights safely home. Naval warning systems scanning beneath the waves. Satellite constellations bouncing signals across oceans. All of them whispering the same message. Someone, once, refused to stop believing in the unseen. There is a profound kind of hope in Bowen's story, a reminder that ordinary people can change everything, not with fame, not with force, but with stubborn brilliance and quiet resolve. It teaches us that being rejected does not mean being wrong, that being doubted does not mean giving up, that the world is often saved not by those who seek glory, but by those who cannot sleep knowing they could have done more. Edward George Bowen outsmarted the U-boats. He changed the Atlantic War. But more than that, he proved that courage takes many forms, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to build something no one believes in until it saves us all. Long after the war ended, long after the medals had been polished and the flags folded, Edward George Bowen's legacy lived on, not in the headlines or in the statues of generals, but in the silent hum of radar stations, in the unseen ripples of a world shaped by vision, not violence. His name rarely appeared in school books. Children did not learn it alongside Churchill or Eisenhower. But in control towers guiding thousands of planes safely across oceans, in naval command centers tracking foreign vessels under ice and sea, Bowen's fingerprints remained, quiet, invisible, but unshakably present. His was a victory not over an enemy, but over invisibility itself, over fear, over doubt, over the cold silence of an ocean that had once swallowed thousands with no warning, no trace, no sound but the tearing of steel beneath the waves. Even in his final years, Bowen was still building, still listening to the signals that others couldn't hear. He spoke at conferences with the same urgency he had carried in the war. His voice had softened, but not his fire. He urged future engineers not to build for glory, but for protection, not to chase power, but to chase clarity. He warned of complacency, of what happens when institutions become too proud to listen, too slow to act, because he had seen firsthand what delay can cost. He never forgot the convoys lost before his radar was deployed. He never forgot the faces of the young men who trusted the sea and were betrayed by its silence. And though the world changed, rockets soared, computers were born, satellites blinked over continents, Bowen's principle never did. We must always find a way to see what others don't. His radar had not just exposed U-boats. It had exposed a way of thinking, that the edge of science is not reserved for the privileged or powerful. It belongs to those who are willing to keep working when the world laughs, to those who dare to build when others doubt, to those who, even when rejected, refuse to turn away. Perhaps that is the final truth of his life, that greatness does not always look like thunder. Sometimes it looks like a man hunched over a desk, soldering wires with trembling fingers, while war rages beyond the walls. Sometimes it looks like persistence in the face of silence. Sometimes it looks like a single dot on a radar screen, small, flickering, and alone, but carrying the weight of lives. And though Bowen died in 1991, decades after the radar towers of World War II had been decommissioned and the submarines turned to rust, his spirit lingered. Wherever a signal bounced off the unknown, wherever a technician stared into the noise, hoping to see through the storm, he had shown the world that invention, real invention, is not about credit or recognition. It is about responsibility, to protect, to warn, to act before it's too late. That's why his story matters, not because he was honored, but because he honored the truth, even when no one else could see it. Today, when we cross oceans without fear, when our aircraft land safely in fog, when we track hurricanes before they strike, when submarines cannot hide and the darkness is no longer blind, it is because one man once said, "We can do more. We must do more, and I will not stop until we do." Edward George Bowen may have walked softly through history, but the waves he created will never stop moving. Because when we choose to see what others do not, when we build what no one believes in, when we fight not for victory but for life, we become like him, part of something eternal.